How the KIO handles this issue remains to be seen, whether it will open a new chapter or simply replace one form of dominations with another.
Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. This is episode 39 on Friday, August 8. Today we're continuing our focus from last week on environmentally destructive rare earth mining in Myanmar. We have an in-depth interview with Emily Fishbein and Hpan Ja Brang. They worked together on a new feature story published this week by Frontier Myanmar. It's all about the Kachin Independence Army's plans for rare earth mines in their territory. Our interview is a bit of a long one this week, so before we get there, I'll just cover two key developments in Myanmar this week. First, spokespersons for the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, that's the TNLA, confirmed on Tuesday that group representatives will meet with Myanmar military officials in Kunming, in Yunnan, for Chinese-brokered peace talks at the end of this month. The TNLA again pointed out the, quote, continuous involvement and pressure, quote, from China, saying, "We cannot escape the Chinese government's pressure. We have to go." Previous ceasefire negotiations in April ended without an agreement after the TNLA rejected the military's demand that they walk away from Nauncho, Sipo, Jaupme, Momake and Mogok. But pressure has sharply mounted on the TNLA since then, and the military retook control of Nauncho just a couple of weeks ago. Since then, they've launched airstrikes on major towns under TNLA control. Fighting towards Mogok has continued this week. The military is steadily capturing villages from the TNLA, which is fighting defensively to keep control of resistance supply routes and slow the military's advance. All eyes will be on those talks at the end of this month, as their outcome could dramatically change or influence the trajectory of the civil war in northern Shan State in anticipation of the military's attempts at elections at the end of this year. And second, while we know that conditions in Arakan Army, that's the AA-controlled Rakhine State, are dire for civilians, news of the AA administration is relatively rare. This is partly because of a lack of internet access. But this week it was reported that the AA has been allowing residents to set up and run their own Starlink services, potentially a positive step towards rehabilitating communications and even the economy in the state. Until now, internet access has been hard to come by, with people reliant on AA-controlled Starlink internet kiosks. The AA's caution about people's right to information in the state is presumably related to their fear of airstrikes. You know, the Myanmar military has hit AA targets based on leaked information in the past, and heavy conflict is continuing in the state. Just this week, there was regular Navy shelling of coastal areas under AA control and clashes near Jalpu. But this lack of communications can also hide atrocities. And this month, the AA's reputation as a governing force has taken some hits, with human rights groups highlighting the AA's crimes against the state's Rohingya population. Human Rights Watch claimed, with evidence on July 28, quote, "The Arakan Army's territorial gains have been accompanied by movement restrictions, pillage, arbitrary detention, mistreatment, and unlawful forced labour and recruitment, among other abuses against the Rohingya." While the group Fortify Rights recommended on July 23rd that the International Criminal Court investigate the AA for war crimes against the Rohingya. And the Arakan National Rohingya Council, just this Monday, accused the AA more specifically of killing over 600 Rohingya civilians in Danshal Khan village, Butadam Township, in May last year. So more internet connectivity in the state may bring more instances like this to light, as well as daily life in the state, which isn't easy. For example, media outlet Western News reported recently that a father was detained by the AA in June for sending 3 of his family members to school in Yangon, and he hasn't been heard of since. The AA actually bans youths of any ethnicity from leaving its territory, and it has a mandatory conscription policy for men under 45 and women under 35. Time will tell how more internet connectivity in AA-controlled Rakhine State pans out. Now, before we get on to the interview, let me just quickly remind you that Frontier Myanmar has another great podcast called Do Atam, which means Our Voice. It's bilingual and it's focused on human rights. Just this Monday, it put out a new episode on bribes, graft and kickbacks, the corruption with impunity going on in Irrawaddy region. Check it out in your podcast app of choice or on the Frontier website. Now, on to the interview. Okay, we're back, and thank you for your patience, listeners, waiting for this feature interview. So on episode 3 of this podcast, in November last year, freelance journalists Emily Fishbein and Jortu Kong explained the significance of the recent victory by the Kachin Independence Army, that's the KIA. Now, that victory was taking substantial territory in Chipwe and Sorlaw townships, known as Kachin Special Region 1 back then, taking that territory from the warlord Zakung Ting Ying, who, with his Myanmar military-aligned border guard force, had been sponsoring increasingly massive environmental destruction and natural resource exploitation in those areas that the BGF controlled. Specifically, Zakung Ting Ying's border guard force protected or ran hundreds of small, rare earth mines close to the border with Yunnan province. These mines made big profits selling minerals to Chinese companies. Most of the mines are around the border town Pangwa. And suddenly, they fell into KIA control. Now, at the time last year, it wasn't clear what the KIA or its political wing, the Kachin Independence Organization, the KIO, it wasn't clear what they intended to do now that they had taken control of these dirty, contaminative, unregulated, but very lucrative mines. We're so lucky that Emily and her collaborators continued following this major story. They published a feature in Frontier this week. It was written by Emily and Jalman Noor, with additional reporting by Hpan Ja Brang. That article focuses on the increasing pressure the KIA is coming under to fully resume rare earth mining around Pangwa, to fully resume it in earnest. So, welcome back to the show, Emily Fishbein, freelance journalist and currently a Pulitzer Center Rainforest Investigations Network Fellow.
Hi.
And welcome also Hpan Ja Brang, an activist for social justice and a journalist hailing from Kachinland. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hello.
So good to have you both. Now, let's get started. First, maybe Emily, could you bring us up to speed on what's happened in northern Myanmar since we last spoke in November? On this show, we've been giving regular updates on the battle in Bamor, resistance victory at Indore, military offensives at Pakant, and other big developments. But listeners may not know so much about the area that used to be called Kachin Special Region 1. And particularly, they may not be aware just how much money is involved in this unregulated industry. So, please.
So, Kachin Special Region 1 is a territory on Kachin State's border with China's Yunnan province. And for decades, it was controlled by a warlord named Zakung Ting Ying and armed groups associated with him. He ran an armed group called the New Democratic Army Kachin, NDAK, which converted into a border guard force in 2009. And since then, that group has been involved in many different businesses and over the past decade, increasingly in rare earth mining in the territory. Last year, in November, the Kachin Independence Army seized that territory and has since been administering the territory through the Kachin Independence Organization. It abolished the name Special Region 1 and now is just considered part of the KIO's overall territory. The conflict, as well as border closures initiated by China, caused rare earth mining to pause in the territory, and it has yet to fully resume. So our recent article was looking at what some of those reasons are, as well as the situation on the ground and what's likely to come for rare earth mining in that Pangwa area.
Yeah, so let's cut right to it. Why hasn't the rare earth mining resumed in the Pangwa area there, right on the border with China?
There's been a lot of speculation about why the mining hasn't fully resumed in KO-controlled territory in the Pangwa area. Some reports have indicated that there were more political factors behind that, and some have indicated economic. In our recent article, we tried to explore that, and we weren't able to get a definitive answer. However, when Brang spoke with Colonel Nabu, the KO's information officer, he said that it was primarily had to do with negotiating contracts, taxation, and other details, more on the economic side, whereas there have been some analysis and speculation as well that political factors may be at play in terms of China, relationships between China and the KIO, as China has in other cases pressured ethnic armed organizations to cease or stop fighting against the military, and the KIO is now waging an intense battle for Bamo, and also supporting the Spring Revolution. So there's some speculation that that may be playing a role in the slowdown. However, when we spoke with Colonel Nabu, he said something like, that is not entirely the truth. So it kind of implies that, there might be some more economic things, but hard to say exactly.
Thanks, Emily. Now, Brang, not just talking about mining, but have there been any other consequences of this KIA victory in what used to be known as Kachin Special Region 1? What are the ongoing strategic implications of that KIA victory?
First of all, I would like to say that my answers will be including both my perspective and also my professionals. So my answer may be a little bit long. So regarding with the questions. So last year, we know that the KIA achieved a major victory by capturing the key border towns in Kachin. Emily earlier mentioned that including the Pangwa, Sotlo, Kambaiti, Chipwe. So those area was previously controlled by the NDAK, or we know that's at Special Region 1. So that the territory was under the influence of the Myanmar militaries for over 30 years and ruled by the notorious the warlocks Khunting. So the region is rich in resources like rare earth minerals, logging, opium, poppies, cultivations, has long been involved in illegal cross-border trade with China. So for decades, the Khunting group ran these operations with taxes backing from the Tatmadaw, while many Kachin communities in the region live under his domination. So initially, when the fighting across Kachin escalated in late 2022 and into 2023, so the Special Region 1 remains relatively quiet. But the situation changed dramatically in October 2024 when the KIA and its alliance PDF forced capture Pangwa and the region's administrative headquarters. So the KIA then officially dissolved the area's special administrative status. So to me, this takeover was not just about the military gains. So the KIO has long had a political goal. So to reunite the Kachin people and establish an independence of federal Kachin state. So taking the control of Special Region 1 was a key to that ambition. So many Kachin sub-ethnic groups like Lower Lechik live in that region and under Khunting control. So they were isolated from the rest of Kachin political movements. Now they are free from that domination. So this region is also important for the trade. So out of Myanmar's 5 officials border trade routes with China's, 2 are located in Kachin, so Kambaiti and Leje. So Kambaiti has been under Khunting control, but the KIA now in charge. So they have solidified their presence along the Chinese border. So earlier in 2024, the KIA also seized Leje, giving them control of both crossings. So this critical because control over border areas mean control over trades, logistics, and taxations. So it also gives the KIA leverage over the Myanmar military by cutting off access to supply lines and staging grounds in northeastern Kachin. So now one of the major military control towns in Kachin is Bamo. So it is the second town of the Kachin. So the town sits on its like national highways linking to the southern Kachin and China and Shan State. So it is served as a with the trade and transportation hub. So it is also near like key water routes and also the rare mining zones. So since the KIA took over Loitte and surrounding areas, rare exports to China have significantly dropped. So fighting around now in Bamor has intensified with both sides viewing it as strategically crucial. So according to reports from BNI and Myanmar Peace Monitor, so more than 100,000 residents, around 70% of the Burma populations have been displaced due to the conflict. So from the strategic standpoint, the KIA's recent victories show that they are not just capable of holding territory, so they are building momentum. So this boosts morale amongst the both Kachin fighters or civilians, while putting growing pressure on the military across the northern Myanmar. So even towns like Michinas, which remains now still under the gender controls, are becoming like increasingly vulnerable. And although the Pagan is like geographically distant, it is a big economy is deeply tied to the militaries. So the KIA's gain in the east could disrupt the military's abilities to finance operations in Pagan or even give the KIA bargaining powers in the long run. So what I want to say is why Special Region 1 may look small on the maps, so it's having outside effects military, economically or politically. So the KIA's controls over this region is like shaping the across the Kachin or the conflict trajectory across all the Kachins. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Brung. There's a lot to think with there.
Nicely said. I learned a lot.
Yeah. Now, Brung, you mentioned the ethnic diversity, the cultural diversity in this part of Kachin State. And I remember that last November, we also talked about this, the challenges that the KIA, KIO will encounter administrating an ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse area where people have been living under a different political system for a long time. So how is that going? What do people think of the KIO on the ground?
The KIOs take over the Special Region 1 presence both like significant opportunities and major challenge. So since the Kachin independent organizations and the political wings of the KIA now face the challenge of governing an ethnically diverse territory marred in a chronic poverty and neglect, which is also one of the world's primary source of rare elements. So before the KIOs can take over of the special regions, the former leaders of the special region ones, they pledged to the civilians or local communities to promote the educations, transport, or economic development. However, in reality, the area was neglected in terms of the public service like educations or healthcare. So the local communities or peoples were isolated from outside of the war or other Kachin areas or other Kachin ethnic tribes. And most of the times and the leaders were unknowingly or collaborated with Chinese businessmen, and then meanwhile the local community suffers under decades of the Ying's corrupt and autocratic rule. So the Ying's also portrays the situation as if the KIA were fighting against its own ethnic group. So as a result, local people were subjected to prolonged indoctrinations, which now pose a challenge for the KIO-KIA administrations in uniting the population in the special region 1. So however, the KIO now has a chance, for me I see a chance to build a more inclusive and accountable administrations, and also invest along neglected public service and to win the trust of the local communities while promoting the economic developments. And there is a strong public hope that the KIOs will govern differently by ensuring the ethnic representations and also the ending forced constructions, because a lot of the locals has complaints. What I heard in recent interview, there has a lot of constructions conducted by the KIA. And another thing is holding its soldiers accountable is important. So seizing the special region, one, a lot of locals complain like KIA soldiers are conducting like a kind of violence or conscriptions or collecting tax. So now the KIO have to ensure that administrations among the publics in special region one to gain the trust from the local peoples. And also, the ethnic divisions still remains in the special region ones. So we all know that the Jingpo is like a kind of the major ethnics in the Kachin tribe. So in special region ones, the population was the lower, more populated in the special region one. So what we hear is the non-Jingpo groups fearing and also they are marginalizing. And also according to our last recent articles, in the article, the KIOs announced that on November 7th, that it would establish a new administration for the former Special Region 1s. The KIO is still facing the challenges. It has not yet released any detailed plans.
One thing that I would like to emphasize is that the KIO has the challenge of administering the territory in a way that is accountable to local people, be that Kachin civil society at large, or the local public in that area. And that is even things that may on the outside seem insignificant, but to local people are very critical, like the language that it uses to speak to them. So the KIO has long used the Jingpo language, but many people in that territory speak other languages, including the Chik and Longhua. So when we spoke with sources, they emphasized that to build the trust with local people, the KIO should speak to them in their own language or not use a language that they don't speak, and also treat them in a way that shows that the KIO is interested in investing in their long-term development as a society.
So, and another major challenge lies in managing the region's lucrative but environmentally disruptive rare earth mining industry. So the KIO has suspended operations and promised to reforms, but it must now prove it can regulate it mining responsible, balancing the need of revenue with environmental protections and public benefit. So what I think is how the KIO handles this issue remains to be seen, whether it will open a new chapter or simply replace one form of dominations with another.
Well, yeah, less domination would be good. Thank you, Brung, for bringing it back to the mines there. Now, your article is titled Strategic Bargaining Chips, Kachin's Rare Earth Mining Pause. And Emily's already touched on the fact that there are political and economic theories about why the rare earth mining hasn't started up again in earnest yet. But I want to ask you specifically about that. So in your view, what are the KIO's options and what's going on politically?
Chinese remains the primary buyer of Myanmar's rare earths. Despite the exploratory talks with the countries like India, the KIO is still like heavily reliant on the China's because the India lacks the necessaries of the processing the infrastructure. So politically now the KIA is under the growing the pressures not only due to the ongoing conflict and also due to the international security, but also become the locals concerned over the environmental degrading or destructions. So in response, the KIO is attempting to balance its politicals and military's objectives with rising demands for transparency and public accountability. So as we know that the KIO is leading like a kind of active roles in the post-coup after the military coup, the uprising has increased their financial burdens, and then particularly in supporting the Spring Revolutions, and then supporting to the local PDF or the NUGs. So even as the public support for its political agendas has such. And however, this has also amplified calls for more transparent and inclusive resource of governance.
Thanks, Brung. That's a really great insight into what the KIO must be thinking right now. And now I want to ask about the commercial side of these mining sites. Emily, there are some amazing maps in this feature story of the rare earth mining sites around Pangwa and Momalt as well. They really give a sense of the scale and how close these mining sites are to China, how easily they can rely on Chinese infrastructure and technicians and that kind of thing. But yeah, the commercial side. So do we know how many companies are actually involved? Like, is it just a few companies but 200 mines that sell to them? Are any of these details discoverable, and are the same companies operating the rare earth mines in southern Hpan State that we talked about on this program last week?
So, tracking rare earth mining in Myanmar, including in Kachin and Hpan State, is in some ways easy and in some ways difficult. It's impossible to hide the mines because they can be seen clearly on satellite imagery. The technique is called in situ leaching, and it uses these large pools where the rare earths are basically leached out using chemicals. And those pools are easy to identify. And as well, there's accompanying deforestation and other things that can be seen on satellite imagery. So it's clear that the mining has dramatically expanded along Kachin State's border with China, especially in the Pangwa area, but also areas that have long been under KIO control, and then more recently in Hpan State as well. However, tracing the industry further is extremely complicated. Chinese customs data shows a huge increase in the import of these rare earth oxide concentrates, which are basically, an indicator of the movement of rare earth across the Myanmar-China border, and show that Myanmar is almost certain to be the world's largest supplier of heavy rare earth elements, which are a subset of rare earth elements that's used in the global energy transition, so electric vehicles and wind turbines, as well as other technological products. However, understanding in detail what's going on is not traceable as it would be in some other countries or contexts, in large part because there's no transparent permitting system. So even during the term of the National League for Democracy, when they were trying to institute some mining governance reform, there were a lot of challenges across mining industries in Myanmar, whether jade, gold, or others, in terms of lack of transparency around mining permits, beneficial owners. However, as challenging as it was then, it's even worse since the military coup. And then in the areas where rare earth mining is happening, it's almost another layer of issues. Or there's the fact that many of these areas most likely had their own permitting systems, as far as we understand from our interviews with sources who are doing research in those areas. It would be unlikely that permits issued for rare earth mining would have been logged with the NLD government. And even under the military regime, hard to say because that's not a transparent information. But it could be that these local authorities have their own permitting systems. And then when we interview sources who are living in those areas or working in those areas, they might not even know that information because these companies, they might not tell the workers the name of the company. So the workers, they just know their assigned task, like, using chemicals, but they don't know what company they work for or who owns the company. Companies tend to operate through joint ventures or shell companies. with Chinese investors behind, and then some local partner generally affiliated with the armed groups in that area. And as well, rumors of Hua companies being involved in Kachin State going back for quite some time. But it's difficult to really put the details or to see those details on paper because that information, it's not publicly available, and it's hard to say where or in what form it exists. And also locals face major risks for speaking out about it as well. So people have a lot of concerns for their own security.
Yeah, that's tricky reporting. I mean, it requires perseverance.
Kind of along with investigating the business side of things, it's also very challenging just generally to document what happened in Kachin when we compare it with, like, for example, recently there was some advocacy on the Thailand side of the border where there was impacts of rare earth mining, and very quickly that reached international media. There was a lot of speaking out advocacy around that, and that is very valuable and important.
Yeah, and that's what our episode last week was all about, an interview with Pai Dites from International Rivers. But continue.
But it also highlights the lack of that in Myanmar, and that's not because the impact is less in Myanmar. We can assume that it would be worse because the mining is actually happening in Myanmar. But the lack of a platform or voice is a major limiting factor in terms of ability to document what's happening or reach an international audience to share that information, including the fact that many people who would be in a position to speak out are not safe to do so. Even civil society now. Recently in our article, we referenced a report that was written by anonymous civil society workers with an anonymous organization that didn't publish their report publicly. And those are even the people who are in the best position to speak out. So we can then think about other people who might have information to share, but not feel safe to do so or not have a platform.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, so I wonder, before we get to civil society, what about, these more official stakeholders, companies, the KIO? Has anybody made any kind of statement about the simple fact that this mining is incredibly environmentally destructive, that this is really serious environmental contamination, changing of the chemical makeup of soil, vegetation, affecting watersheds, rivers, natural resources that people depend on? So have there been any recognition statements of this kind at all, let alone pledges to ameliorate or mitigate that?
From the Myanmar side, no. The Kachin Border Guard Force, as far as I'm aware, never engaged on these, environmental issues. The KIO has, made some indications that they are more interested in doing the mining in an environmentally friendly way and in a way that recognizes the local population's concerns and respects their interests and needs. However, they haven't released any publicly available resource governance policy, so it's still difficult to say, or rare earth mining policy. It's difficult to say in practice how the situation will go. Back in 2023, the KIO canceled a rare earth mining project in another part of its territory in response to public protests. However, it continued to mine rare earth in other areas and even crack down on protests against the mining. So there's still, hope among civil society and activists that the KIO will take the public concerns into consideration in the way it manages rare earth mines in the Pangwa area. However, the mining hasn't yet fully resumed, so there's still a lot of things to be confirmed or to be seen.
Yeah, fair enough. And the KIO is aware of civil society groups that are trying to hold it to account regarding these rare earth mines. So what's been happening on that front, Brang?
So the Kachin Civil Society is like kind of responded to the red mining in the KIO control areas with a mix of advocacies, caution, and growing demands for the transparencies. So group like the Kachin Resources Concern Group have conducted field visits and summits submitted reports to monitor mining activities, rising concerns about the environmental damage and the lack of public consultations. So the civil society actors are calling on the KIO to manage the rare earth minings in a way that the protects local communities and the ecosystems to adopt the transparent governance practice. While some activists acknowledge the KIO's efforts to provide the basics, surveys and claims and resource management policy in a place, they are skeptical due to the policy's lack of the public's disclosure. So civil societies hope the KIO will avoid the secretive or exploitative practice of the past regimes and instead building the public trust by engaging meaningful with affected communities and ensuring fair distributions of the benefits to the public. Yeah, a lot of civil societies have trying to advocate the KIOs. However, at the moment, due to the ongoing conflicts, so in our recent last year or in 2023, as the earlier Emily mentions, a lot of local people protest to halt the rare earth mining in the Mansi. At the times, a lot of the civil societies has conducted the consultation with the public and then they reported internally, not publicly. They sent the letters to the KIA's headquarters. So, however, what we see is so far the KIA was doing transparent governance on the rare earth minings. So, how do they practice? We don't know yet. And also, that KIA will always give like kind of reason they are doing of finding the funds for the resisting for the military coup, and also they have to spot our peoples or the PDF. So they are just like giving that kind of reason. So this is like a kind of slowly damaging on the public trust. Why the environmental is totally destructions and then really affecting on the local people's their livelihoods. So what I read on one scholars, they said this kind of the rare earth mining areas, since we know that the rare earth mining was used with the
acid, yep.
To reuse that kind of areas, the one that used by the minings, so it takes like a kind of 50 or 100 years to become normal like the areas. So because of this acid, they destruct a lot of the environments. So to become or to reuse the areas like farmings. So it takes a lot of the 50 years or 100 years. Since they use the chemicals, the trees are like absorbing, instead of water, they are absorbing the chemicals. And also, so for us, a lot of Kachin civil societies are facing like a challenges to reach the mining area sites, since the governments or the companies requirements or the Chinese company demands to the local authorities not to enter the outsiders or because of their like confidentials, because and also the civil society cannot reach because of their safeties. So if they do something, they can get like a kind of harmful potential threat of harmful. And also the internet access is really problem to receive the relevant data for the civil society. So this kind of situation is facing among the Kachin civil society at the moment.
Thank you both so much. This has been so fascinating. But for this last question, I want to sort of, take a step back and think, well, everything we've been talking about is kind of predicated on the Kachin Independence Army actually holding this territory. So I wonder, Zukung Ting Ying, he's very old. Him and his elite sort of cronies, they fled to China when the KIA took the territory last year. But is that the end of it? I presume they're still in China. And this is, Myanmar we're talking about. There are a lot of exchanges of territory. There's a lot of cross-border machinations. I mean, is this the end militarily of that border guard force? Or could Tsukung Ting Ying or his family or his close confidants, could they still cause trouble for the KIA? Is the KIA's hold of this new territory secure?
It's extremely unlikely that the Kachin Border Guard Force or affiliated militia group would have the military strength to stage a significant comeback in the territory. They were militarily defeated by the KIA, and in order to make a significant counterattack, they would need major support from the military. Whether the military would provide that support, it's difficult to predict, but at the moment, it's unlikely that they would stage a comeback on their own. However, the border guard force and militia and the people in charge have always been very business oriented and have always been able to adapt their business to a very changing context, whether it be logging, opium, bananas, gold mining, whatever the industry, they've found ways to adapt. So a bigger question maybe to ask is whether they'll find other ways to keep doing business. Stay tuned for my upcoming reporting for more on that.
I certainly will. Now, before we finish up, is there anything that either of you would like to add?
Throughout all of this, there's the obvious fact that Chinese investors are behind rare earth mining in Myanmar, and that the boom in rare earth mining in Myanmar is for export across the China border. And it seems very likely in part because China doesn't want the destruction to be happening in China. And that message has been made loud and clear by our sources. So I wanted to end with a quote from one Kachin activist, which is, "China has been abusing the environment of Kachin State. It is like stealing something when the internal situation of its neighbor is unstable."
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. I mean, the instability, the suffering, the chaos inside Myanmar, it presents problems for neighboring countries, but it also presents opportunities in some ways. Unfortunately, there are vested interests in chaos. Okay, I didn't mean to go on a little tangent there. So thank you so much, Emily Fishbein, for coming on the show, and thank you so much, Hpan Ja Brang. Your insights have been really fantastic, and I really appreciate them, our listeners as well. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you for having us for the podcast.
This was really fun, and I appreciate your amazing questions. And Brang, also, you said a lot of things that were new to me, and I learned a lot from you. So thanks.
Yeah, and by way of wrapping up the episode, let me also say how much I appreciate all the listeners for keeping up with what's happening in Myanmar. Be sure to check out the new content on the Frontier Myanmar website. Not just the story that we talked about today with Emily and Brang, but there's another great piece up on the economic effects of the titanic damage that the March earthquake inflicted on the centuries-old buildings at the former capital, Imwa. Locals there relying on tourism are now being forced to find new work, and the military regime is leaving the damaged buildings and the ruins to nature with no repairs in sight. And remember that we love your questions and feedback about this podcast. So why don't you email us, whimyanmar@proton.me. Really looking forward to hearing from you. Until next week, farewell and take care.